try a new...
Hello, I'm Myles Brand, President of the NCAA, and I welcome you this evening with Walter Cronkite. I invite you to look at a video of a man who's been in front of the public delivering the news for almost 7 decades. So enjoy the video, and then Walter Cronkite will join us.
Walter Cronkite.
It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Cronkite.
Call me Walter.
Hello, I'm Walter Cronkite.
I got a call from Ed Murrow, who wanted me to come to work at CBS. Now that I had a family and a mortgage, I thought, well, why not?
Good evening, everyone. Here is the news.
So that was the beginning. Anchoring the news and covering the news, first on that CBS station in Washington, and then on the network from New York.
This is Walter Cronkite.
Everything we did was for the first time.
And you were there. Behind me, you see the course of the Explorer.
Sometimes when things went wrong, they really went wrong.
Unfortunately, however, the film seems to be upside down. This is Walter Cronkite reporting.
I was assigned to take over the CBS Evening News in the spring of 1962.
Soviet Premier Khrushchev has called for an 18-nation...
The Supreme Court today legalized abortion.
A flurry of activity at the Jack Ruby trial today.
Will try to suggest, at least, the enormous scope of the pollution problem alone.
Ultimate risk of a meltdown at the 3 Mile Island atomic power plant.
I spent 19 years at that desk.
The Arab oil embargo.
Watching historic changes in everything from the world order
President Reagan today opened
to clothes and hairstyles, including my own.
The impeachment of President Richard Nixon.
The 60s, undoubtedly, were the most turbulent decade of this century.
I have a dream.
There were the assassinations.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
Most of the day, I didn't have keenly felt emotions, except for the moment when I had to say that the president was dead.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
And I almost lost it there. Hell no! I went to Vietnam for the first time in 1965. The American people were confused.
The firing still goes on.
They were confounded by what was going on, even as I was.
But the only rational way out then will be to negotiate.
I recall that LBJ said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the war.
The beginning of man's greatest adventure.
The landing on the moon presented an interesting emotional challenge for me.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
When that vehicle landed on the moon, I was speechless. I really couldn't say a thing.
Boy. Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
At a time when there were a lot of other problems in this country and elsewhere, people were downcast. Everybody there was upcast. We were looking toward the stars, looking toward the moon, looking toward getting out there. There was a spirit that was absolutely incomparable.
This is my last broadcast as the anchorman of the CBS Evening News. For me, it's a moment for which I long have planned, but which nevertheless comes with some sadness.
Since he retired from the Evening News, he's been doing different things.
Yet the Hudson cleanup was a major success story.
He's done a whole bunch of documentaries, nature and historical, travel, a series of shows on Discovery. With me, we've made a series of 12 one-hour public policy shows.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I get a lot of recognition on the street these days from little toddlers around who weren't even born while I was doing the evening news. And it turns out it's all from dinosaurs. I did a 4-hour series on dinosaurs.
Did you see that?
And little kids keep coming up to me and saying, "You're the dinosaur man." Well, it was quite a century. The best of times, the worst of times. But you know, if there's anything I've learned, it is that we Americans do have a way of rising to the challenges that confront us. Just when it seems we're most divided, we suddenly show our remarkable solidarity. The 20th century may be leaving us with a host of problems, but I've also noted that it does seem darkest before the dawn. There's reason to hope for the 21st century, and that's the way it will be. Thank you.
Audience members will find on their seats a card which you can ask questions. Please pass them at any time during the talk to the side, and we'll have a question period otherwise.
Myles, would you like to have me amplify just a couple of little things you saw in the film there a minute ago?
We would love that, Walter.
Well, it's very hard to select a few things like that. I did that for a promotional thing some time ago. But you saw those two little chimpanzees hopping around them. That was a wonderful story in Western Africa. We were there trying to we did a documentary on the fact that there are several people trying to save the chimpanzees from the poachers. And the poachers get out there in the woods and kill their mothers and kidnap literally the babies and then sell those. And there's quite an effort to save them, of course. Well, we were at one of these camps where the little chimp babies are there, and I'm talking about the babies, and they're dancing around on my lap like you saw. And in this opening copy I came with, I said, you know, they seem to understand us, and which they do. They really seem to understand. And I said that, you know, that they even seem to love us. Well, as I said, even seem to love us. The little chimp baby on my lap turned back and looked at me kind of strangely, went whack and hit me across the face. And of course, everybody watching laughed, thought it was pretty funny. I didn't think it was as funny as they did, but it was a pretty good whap. And so we did it over, of course. Had to do that. And we did it over 3 times. We did this over, and every time I said they even seemed to love us, whacked it. And I didn't know the same one or not doing this, but it was a little bit touch and go there for a while, and that's no pun intended. There was a scene there also where you saw General Eisenhower. We were on the beaches at Normandy. We took him back there with the with CBS. For the, I think it was the 10th anniversary or something of the kind. And he had been, of course, there on D+3, and he'd been there after that several times. He'd been back in peacetime, but every time it was in peacetime, it was a ceremony. De Gaulle was there, the bands were playing and all this sort of thing. He never really had a chance to look around the beach the way an average person would. So we took him over, and we spent almost a week around there making a documentary picture. That scene, we were finally on Normandy Beach with a Jeep, and we were going to drive along the beach, and he was going to tell me what happened at these various spots. See, so I'm to get into the Jeep and drive the Jeep. He's alongside. Well, I had one of my rarely bright ideas, and I said to our producer, Fred Friendly, I said, Fred, I just have an idea. You know, he's showing me around. Why don't we ask him to drive? Let him drive. Wouldn't that be more interesting? He said, great idea. And he went over and and spoke as producers are inclined to do. He said, "General, I just had a great idea." He said, "How would it be? Do you drive?" And of course, Ike said, yes, I drive. Of course I drive. And he said, "Well, the idea is for you to drive, and you'll be telling Cronkite about what happened here." Well, up on a little knoll where the cemetery is there, the cemetery at the beach, Betsy was with Mamie Eisenhower, my wife, Mamie. And Mamie, when he got into the driver's seat, grasped Betsy's hand and said, "My dear, is Ike driving?" And Betsy said, "Well, it certainly looks like it." He said, "Oh, my dear," grasped her hand and said, "You have never been in greater danger." Said he hasn't driven in 25 years, and he didn't drive at all well then. So there's a story behind every story.
Yes, thank you. That's wonderful. You know, you've been an icon to American news and a cultural icon in this country for over 6 decades. You've been a commentator and a reporter, and I'd like to explore with you some of the experiences you have and how things might have changed over the last half century. And to begin, let's talk a little bit about the role of the media and how that has changed and how you perceive the role of the media in terms of shaping America. You know, television was the new media when you began, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how it was when you were on the air. What do you think the impact of television was in reporting the news? How important was television?
Of major importance. It changed the whole perception of our world, our cities, our towns, our neighbors indeed, as well as the more remote parts of the world which were playing such a part already on our lives and our future. It was an introduction of our people and peoples around the world to the rest of the world. And they began to get an understanding of each other to a degree that at first looked very hopeful. We were just out of the war practically, and people were looking for peace, hoping for peace. And as we met each other at various stories at the time, we began to believe we were going to have an understanding of each other. We now know that it didn't quite work out as we had hoped, but it did increase our understanding of world affairs and has perhaps, in a sense, saved us from ourselves. Of course, the end of the war, World War II, was the beginning of the atomic age. And as we explained to the populations of the world and all the nations, but particularly with us in the United States, where we owned nearly all the nuclear weapons available, we had an understanding through the pictorial nature of it. Just the pictorial nature of seeing the damage in Nagasaki and Hiroshima was enough to, I think, begin to clarify with the American people the dangers that we had created with the atomic bomb. It may have brought early victory in Japan, but it certainly didn't ease the conscience of man around the world in all aspects. But what it did was, in that major story and in every other political story around the world and problem story around the world, domestically as well as worldwide, it increased our understanding of what was happening in our world. And that depended a great deal on the proficiency of those of us who were doing it. It was a new thing to us too, so we had to learn to communicate, as well as the people had to learn to understand what we were trying to tell them.
Well, since television has been around, it's changed a lot. A lot of news stations, cable stations, CNN, Fox, CNBC. How has it changed, do you think, and has it changed for the better?
Well, that depends on the operators and what their intentions are. I think that the well-done news broadcast, the the larger networks that came along and had a lot of practice before the cable networks came in. I think we were doing a pretty good job. As cable came in, they began to try to soup up their reports, as it were. And I think in some cases they've done very good work. In other, not so hot. One of the things I find most difficult with the cable networks are their talk shows, so-called. And they realize they are trying to accomplish a little entertainment along with news, and as a consequence, they shout at each other. That's all part of the game, and I absolutely hate that. I can't stand it. Most of the commentators, the hosts, are good news people, know what they're doing. They are demanded, they're asked by their companies to get more spice into it, more entertainment, if you please. And they lead to this shouting back and forth. And while the masters of ceremonies are educated and they've got very good subjects on the air. But I want to hear what they've got to say, not shouting at each other. I get very unhappy with that.
So news has blended together with entertainment and maybe even editorial. Have they all mixed together as opposed to just good news reporting?
Well, one of the I think efforts today of management is to get more entertainment out of news than the factual material we journalists would prefer to be doing. The problem there is that they are losing viewers to the cable people with their entertainment type news, if you please. Some of it's quite good, understand, but a lot of it is not. And when it's not good, the news is distorted in order to get more entertainment into it and therefore more viewers. The thing is, they've taken a lot of the viewers from the networks, and the three old major networks still attempt to do the job they've done, but we see our audience dwindling quite a bit, and therefore the management that has to depend on a large audience to get the commercials in there are keeping on. They're passing on a request, it seems to me, sometimes more obvious than others, of getting a little entertainment feature in there. One of the reasons for that is because they want the younger people to listen to the news, and they don't. They've gone to, believe it or not, to the what do you call
computers?
it? Yeah, sure, the computers, and they are actually taking audience from television. So there is this battle to hold on to the number of viewers by the commercial networks, and I don't think they're in all cases winning that battle.
Well, you're obviously an advocate for good news and good reporting. What do you think the bedrock principle of good reporting is that maybe some of the cable stations are missing right now, and the networks, CBS, have done so well in the past? What is the bedrock principle?
Well, it's the old principles of print journalism. It's good journalism. It's honesty, fairness, truth, and totality of the story, telling both sides of a controversial story. All of those things should be practiced in every story that is carried on the air, as they once were in the better newspapers. Even they have slipped a little bit in recent times. They have lost readership with these same various pressures, to the degree that they're kind of jazzing up the news, if you please. And that's unfortunate. I think that the good journalists, the old timers in there, are fighting the good fight in trying to hold on to what we know to be the principles of good journalism. And I think we're succeeding most of the time, but I see a few cracks appearing in the walls there.
Well, of course, you are the journalist everyone wants to model themselves on. And I want to ask you...
well, I'm not sure. I'm unemployed.
I want to ask you one question. What were the influences in your life in the way you conducted journalism, the model that you set that others followed? What influenced you in thinking about journalism?
Well, I came along in the early days before radio had just come in when I got into journalism from the University of Texas, which won a pretty good football game the other day. I'd like to mention that.
We'll get up to that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But at any rate, I had the good fortune I wanted to be a journalist. I had the good fortune, as a matter of fact, to gain that interest with a high school, one of the first high schools in the country that taught journalism in high school. And we had a wonderful old principled journalist, a former city editor of one of the papers, who offered his services to appear at one of the high schools once a week. And he was just a stickler for the old principles. And that's all he taught, really, the principles of good, honest, fair journalism. And it did those of us who had the privilege of being exposed to his teaching a lot of good. We turned out to be some pretty good folks.
You certainly did. One of the things I remember most in watching you on CBS News was your reporting from Vietnam. It was a seminal time, as the video said, a tumultuous time during the 60s in our country. And you went to Vietnam during 1968 at the Tet Offensive and came back and reported that we were mired in a stalemate, to quote you. And President Johnson subsequently commented that, and I quote here, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." And shortly thereafter, he withdrew from the presidential race, as you recall. The question I want to ask you as a journalist, were you making news and affecting public policy at that time, or were you just reporting?
I was doing something other than news. I was doing commentary and editorial commentary. This was a departure from everything I'd been doing and was taught to do. When I went over to Vietnam for the Tet Offensive, I'd been there several times, but I had to see why the communists were so successful. I was very much concerned, as others were. I went out on the battlefield and watched the fight going on and how we were doing with it. And when I saw it, I wanted to do this piece, but I came back. I was doing a straight news piece and from there, and then doing a wrap-up of what I'd seen there in a documentary, which had been the intention all along. Well, the boss at CBS News at the time was a very strict journalism devotee and news devotee, and would not permit any of us to ever do anything like a editorial comment at all, not a two-worder he would fire us for. But now I came back, and suddenly he called me back into his office. I was doing working on the documentary I was going to do the next night. And he said, "You know what? We may have a responsibility here we haven't recognized. We get all this mail from our viewers, and it almost balances out with the same weight of mail, because it was more than we could open, that condemned us for our reporting and thought we were against the war, and those who condemned us for supporting the war." And he said, as long as we have this kind of a reputation, I think we have a duty to work with that for the American people if they're good. I think you, Cronkite, ought to do a piece saying just exactly what you think about the situation out there, and let's see how it goes. And so I sat down and wrote my piece which said that I thought that we were losing the war. We were certainly not winning it. The cost in blood and gold was just too much for us, and that the only thing for us to do was to get the devil out of there. Well, it was pretty strong piece for the time, but he said, if that's what you believe, that's what we put on the air. And we put it on the air, and it had a pretty heavy effect because Johnson, which I didn't know at the time, but I did know he watched television every night, watched the 3 networks. And he was watching our documentary, and he got up and he clicked it off in the Oval Office where his people sat with him and watched the news. He got up and angrily clicked it off and said, well, if I've lost America, I've lost the war. And with that, 2 days later, he announced he was not going to run for re-election. So I guess it had a pretty big effect. It certainly did on him. And it had some effect because then the Pentagon chief resigned. All of them resigned practically. The whole election about to come up was tilted by this, and it apparently had some effect, I must say.
It certainly did.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. And we know it took a few more years to leave Vietnam, but that was an important message you sent. Everyone agrees with that. I certainly do. You know, while we're talking about issues of politics, maybe we could switch a little into that. And you've been an observer and a commentator of the American political scene for a very long time. What surprised you in the last half century about American politics? What got your attention?
Well, one of the things was the way television affected it. When we went to the conventions for the first time, and the convention was conducted as they always had been, both of them, the Democratic and Republican, with a lot of shouting on the floor, a lot of demonstrations, even a fight or two, people fighting for the microphone. And the public saw our politics in the raw, the way they'd been done ever since the Revolution, practically. And as a consequence, there was a lot of criticism on the people. And the two parties, both of them, 4 years later, changed their whole mode in the conventions and stopped all of the free talk from the floor, all the debate from the floor, all the arguments from the floor were hushed up. And the people were given an absolutely false view of how politics was conducted in our country. And that was a great shame, because seeing it as it was conducted, it was pretty raw, but it was also honest. The people may have been a little honest in some of the demands they made on the floor, but basically the functioning was an honest, straightforward. We haven't had that since. Ever since then, the political conventions have simply been promotional devices. Every speech is monitored before it's made. Every argument is taken to a side room. The policy making committee, the foundation of the campaign was all done in secret. It wasn't done in the open in the convention. It was done in private rooms. That sort of thing. The selection of the delegates to the convention was secretly done. It just changed the entire nature of political work in this country, and that's a terrible shame. We'd be far better off today if we were talking openly to each other about how things should go, and honestly, and not putting so much of it in closed rooms. We can hope for the better, perhaps, coming along. We're getting some greater honesty on the Internet, and that's one reason why the young people are watching Internet rather than watching the news on television. And it's one of the reasons we have to be working harder to hold them without promising them entertainment in the news, but the truth in the news.
Well taken. Now, you have to understand, I'm in a very awkward situation. I am interviewing Walter Cronkite, one of the great interviewers of all time.
I'm sure you're going to be fair. You better be.
Well, of the many, many interviews you've done over your time, and particularly with world leaders, which ones impressed you and you walked away with a different point of view as a result of talking with them?
Well, the most important interview I ever did was when Anwar Sadat became the head of the Egyptian government. And he was an unexpected leader. The government had been run by the military, a cadre of 5 generals. He was the least of those, expected to be go to the top upon, in this case, the death of the fellow who was running the country. But somehow or other they picked Anwar Sadat. And everybody who had any knowledge of Egyptian politics felt with certainty that they were putting him into the job to remove him as soon as they could decide who would be the general taking over, because he was the weaker one of that. Well, so they pointed him, and everybody assumed it was a temporary thing. He didn't start out doing anything of any great importance. But since nobody really understood him, I decided I would get the first television interview with him. I was always kind of fascinated with Egyptian and Middle Eastern news. So I went over and got this interview. He granted it to me. And I flew over and sat down. We sat down under the banyan trees with the flies and mosquitoes all around us. And his smoking his pipe and I smoking my pipe. The one thing we had in common at any rate. And it was boring. He was talking about what he was going to do with Egypt and all that kind of thing. And he droned on and on. And I had been up all night flying, and I could hardly stay awake. My eyes were closing. And then I suddenly thought I heard him say, "And I shall go to Israel." And I said, I couldn't have heard that. I said, excuse me, did you say you were going to Israel? Yes, Walter. I shall go to Israel. When are you going? He said, I will go anytime. My gosh, I had quite a story. But then I said, well, what are the conditions? He said, well, just as soon as they get out of the Sinai and, and that all, the whole litany of things that the Egyptians wanted out of them. So I didn't have a story at all. And I went home and reported this stuff, but I didn't report that. It wasn't an interesting story. It was, it just wasn't anything of importance. However, it turned out that he was repeating that to some people, and not so long after I had been with him, a Canadian delegation was visiting the Middle East, the Canadian parliamentary delegation, and they were in the hall as he was speaking to his Congress, to his thing. And in it he said, and I shall go to Israel. And they had to leave to catch a plane to go to Israel themselves. So they never heard any contradiction of that or any conditions for it. But when they got to Israel, they started spreading this around, that he had said he was coming to Israel. Well, that got a lot of talk in the press, in Israel particularly, and that was on a weekend. So as soon as I got in for the evening news on Monday, I called up my new friend Sadat, and I said, there's all this talk because this Canadian delegation was there when you made a mention. I said, what are you going to go to Israel? Yes, Walter. I said, well, what are the conditions? Well, just as soon as they get out of the Sinai, the same old stuff. So I said, well, then those would be your conditions for going to Israel. He said, no, Walter. Those would be the conditions for peace. I would go anytime. And I said, would you go today? Yes, Walter. And I said, well, you probably would need an invitation from the Israelis. He said, yes. They would have to invite me. And I said, great, thank you. Well, we immediately got on. My producer already was getting on the air. We got to Begin, the head of, in Israel. And we got him. I got him on a telephone, a wire, and told him about this. And he looked like I'd hit him in the solar plexus. He looked like he was breathless. He said he would come here. And I said, yes, well, tell him to come. Tell him to come. And I said, well, I think he would need an invitation. Tell him he's got an invitation. I said, well, I can't tell him that. It's up to you to tell him that. Well, you can do it. I said, well, I can't do it. And he said, well, I'll get it done. I'll have your American embassy do it. They'll do anything we ask them. I'm sure he said that. People later said they didn't hear him say it, but I think at any rate, they indeed invited him. I told him that he said could come that week, and that was Monday. And he said, well, I want him to come. He must come, but I can't have him come this week. I've got a meeting in London with the Prime Minister. Never mind that. That's not important. Tell him to come. Tell him. So he came. And that was the beginning of the rapprochement. Right. That it still goes on to that degree. Sadat was a very brave man to do that. And indeed, it did cost him his life. I'm sure he was assassinated by some of his Egyptian radicals. And a great shame, because I think one of the greatest things that's important in a politician is political courage. And when it takes courage, the leaders must exercise that courage and do what they know is right. Now, I'm not talking necessarily about physical courage, but political courage. And there are not enough of our leaders and other leaders in other countries that have that courage.
Could you think of someone else who's had that courage? Maybe Khrushchev, perhaps?
Well, yes, there are some. Willy Brandt, who was the mayor of Berlin, had political courage, because although he made a mistake, he said what he believed to be right when the country was divided. And he said, I do not see a future in which we will again be united. It turned out he was wrong, of course. But he believed that was so, and that he should tell the people rather than keep them believing that it was going to take place.
Let me change the topic a little bit. I've been an educator for about 40 years, and we have great pride in our American higher education system. Do you believe, as I do, that education is important for democracy?
Oh my gosh, it is essential to democracy, and we're not doing the job. We are definitely not doing the job. I sink my stomach every time there's one of these reports from Europe, Western Europe particularly. Then they come in quite frequently, as they do in this country, saying how well their young people are doing in school, how they're succeeding in mathematics, in science, all these fundamentals, and how far ahead of our students they are in the same system of tests. And it's a disaster is what it is, an absolute disaster. We are not paying the attention to education, and particularly higher education, but all education, as we must if we want this democracy to succeed. We are failing. We are failing in the ability of our teachers. We're paying our teachers less than the people who clean up after them in school, the janitors. They're making more than the teachers are. These are the teachers, these people we're turning our children over to, depending upon their success in education. And they're not getting it around the country. The facilities are terrible. The schools are torn down. And particularly the teachers with whom we give our children's future are failing their job because we're not getting the best teachers. They're not paid adequately. You know, I think that our democracy is a really seriously great danger Thomas Jefferson said it a long time ago. He said, the nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never can and never will be. And we are an ignorant nation compared to some of the other nations and compared to what we should be doing in teaching our young people. It is a tragedy, an absolute tragedy. Democracy cannot survive with an ignorant electorate.
I think everyone would agree with that. Absolutely. Thank you. Now, there is one unique feature to change the subject a little bit, one unique feature about American education, and that is that we combine sports with education in this country, and we don't do that in any place else in the world. Do you think that's a good idea to have sports and education in one place?
Well, I think it's a very good thing to have it in one place, as long as we quit doing what we're doing is buying the players in our games. We pay them to do the job rather than to learning what they should be learning at school. The two things have been crossed. And I know that you're working very hard in straightening it out, and I think there's improvement being made. But it's urgent that you keep on with this, Myles, and make it work quickly.
I will take that good advice to heart. Now,
I thought you might, if it came up.
Now, getting back to University of Texas.
You bet. Hook 'em horns.
Did you see the game, the Rose Bowl game?
I did indeed. I wouldn't have missed it. However, I darn near missed it. I thought the game was badly televised. It seemed to be a new crew doing that kind of thing, and we got nothing but a long shot of every play, and we never went to a close-up, and it got boring, quite boring. And I was just about to turn that off when I said, there's only a couple more minutes to go, so I'll stick with it. And indeed, 19 minutes we won it.
Oh, good. I'm glad you were watching. It was a great game.
I don't know what I would have done if I'd missed that. Oh God.
You know, over the years, Walter, we take survey after survey about who's trusted in America. And one of the remarkable things about your career is that over a long span of time, you've kept America's trust. You have really been the voice of reason and objectivity in our country. Would you talk about your career in any way you like on CBS News and on television? But you have to do me one favor. You have to end your conversation with a particular line.
Oh, all right, I can guess that. Well, I have been very lucky, very, very lucky. I was a young newspaper man in the early days just before World War II. And when World War II, my organization, United Press, I was just on the desk in New York at that time. And I'd had a chance to be on some pretty good big stories. And they immediately said, get yourself a uniform or whatever it takes and get over to England. And I did almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. I went over to one of the first convoys when we got in the war. And it was an exciting story. And I did a couple of convoy duties and then made the landing in North Africa, and then was brought back to England as they were still getting pretty heavy bombing. The story was there, and then we began to turn and get the American Air Force into the battle, and I stayed covering the air war for a large part of the war until we got onto the continent, D-Day and all. And then was on the front with the troops until we got out. Battle of the Bulge was a great story. And I flew with the Air Force. Some of us correspondents got occasional ride. Going over Germany in a B-17, wasn't all fun, but it was certainly one of the stories that had to be carried. So I had a good war, and then they sent me immediately after the war to the Nuremberg trial. So I was able to sit there for a year and watch Goering spinning his lies and the rest of them, the 21 of them in the dock. Then just as they were sentenced, I was sent to Russia, and I missed the hangings. I'm not sure I would have been assigned to them anyway, but at least I would have been there. But instead I was sent to Moscow, where things were tightening up in the Cold War. So I went there for a couple of years and finally got home later, still with United Press. And very shortly, the war in the Far East began. CBS then hired me to go to Korea. I actually didn't get there. I was getting ready to go when the CBS acquired ownership of a station in Washington, and they had to get a news department right away, and most of the old timers had gone to the Far East by then, and I was the only guy around, so they had to use me. I didn't know anything more about it than they did, much less than about it. But in the very first week, we got a sponsor for the evening news, and in a couple of weeks, we got a second sponsor for the 11 o'clock news, and I was hooked into television, and I stayed with CBS, still am.
Yeah. And could you remind us how you signed off each day?
Well, what's the date? What's the date? The 8th?
8th, that'll do.
Sunday the 8th?
Yes.
Oh, and that's the way it is. Sunday, and the month is January. Sunday, January 8th. This is Walter Cronkite. That's the way it is. Thank you. A great audience. Great audience. Thank you.
Well, we promised the audience an opportunity to ask some questions, and let us begin. We have two interns from the NCAA who will ask them.
Mr. Cronkite, please recall for us those moments when you were waiting for the re-entry of the Apollo 13 spacecraft, especially after 3 minutes had passed.
Well, when we landed on the moon, that is still the greatest story of our time, the greatest story of almost any time, that man escaped his environment on one orb and reached out and walked on another on the landing on the moon. It was the greatest story, and I maintain that is a story, the date of which the children who will be living out in space, on the planets perhaps, and certainly on man-made cities, that will be the date that they will remember, will be the date that man landed on the moon. They'll know that 500 years from now, and I'm so sure of that, because all we've got to do is ask ourselves, what is the one date in history back 500 years ago that almost every school child knows? It's the day that Columbus landed on the American continent. Well, don't tell me that it won't be just as big a story the day we escaped the continent, the continent, and landed on the moon. That story will be the story. This century of ours just passed and continuing is a tremendous century of progress, particularly in medical devices, lengthening life, and in all sorts of things, transportation, the jet airplane, for heaven's sake, the automobile, all of these things in the last 100 years, the telephone, now the radio, television. My gracious, what progress we made! But that landing on the moon, that will be the story, I believe.
That can make someone speechless, I assume.
That's right, absolutely, yes. Well, I'm sorry you mentioned that. I had all the time. I had just as much time to get ready for that landing as NASA did. I covered the story of the building of the first rockets from the very beginning. In fact, I watched the German rockets launched from Holland, and I had some familiarity with them. I covered the space program from the very beginning, and Wally Schirra, the wonderful astronaut, great sense of humor, great man. We had hired him. He'd retired. We hired him as our expert at the anchor desk with me. But he always wanted to know what I was going to say. And he said to me, for that event, he was on his desk, mine, and he said, what are you going to say? I don't know what I can say if I don't know what you're going to say. And I said, I don't have any idea. But I ad-lib these things, and I'll say, well, we got to the landing on the thing, and everything's going fine, and they landed on the moon, and I was speechless, absolutely speechless. I couldn't say a thing. What I said was, boy, oh boy, wow, oh boy. I mean, really, it goes down in history, obviously, and that was my effort of the morning. Yeah.
Mr. Cronkite, reporters about Hurricane Katrina have been criticized for showing emotions. Is there room for honest emotions in response to tragedies today?
What was that?
The question is, when someone reports news, particularly a tragedy, a war, or a hurricane like Katrina, should reporters show emotion, or should they be purely objective in their speech?
Oh, I don't mind their showing emotion at all if they feel it. Many do. I have at times, but you can't let it get in the way of an impartial broadcast. You've got to tell the facts as you would whether you were personally affected or not. And that is the job of the professional, to continue with the broadcast as needed. The assembling of information, the commentary about what is happening has to be reported impartially.
Impartially. Good.
Who is the one person you would like to interview that you never got to? Why? And what would you ask?
Actually, I think two of the arch enemies of all time. I would like to have interviewed Hitler, and I would like to have interviewed Stalin. I'd like to have gotten a close-up of how those guys thought, how they could commit the things they did for masses of people, particularly Hitler. But the other guy was just as bad. I covered both. I didn't know I'd never covered Hitler, but I was in Russia for 2 years. I saw saw Stalin in action a couple of times, but no correspondent while I was there got an interview with him. We had never had him personally to talk to.
Well, I know you interviewed all the presidents for some time, and you also interviewed candidates.
Yes, indeed.
Now, which candidate who did not win would you think have made a good president?
Ooh, that's a nice, tough one. I'll tell you, I think Adlai Stevenson. However, there was a problem there that I realized as the campaign went on. He was brilliant. He was the best informed, best educated, perhaps, of any of those who ran and didn't get elected. Maybe as well as those who got elected. But I learned something, as we learned following him on the campaign trail. He was brilliant, and he wrote brilliantly. He wrote his own stuff and would read from it and go a little ad-lib about it. But he would write these very brilliant tomes on what he expected to do and would do. And then when he got into the speech that he was making to some audience or other, trying to persuade, he would alter it a little bit. He would weaken it. And we would see him on the stand, as a matter of fact, sitting on the stage waiting to go on, and he'd be scratching out things and running things. And the stuff he scratched out was the really tough stuff. the stuff where he really went after the issue. But he weakened. He would begin to explain away the problem rather than say what could be done about it. And I think it was because of his intelligence. He just saw the other side of everything. And as he saw the other side, it weakened his argument, of course, for a side that he believed was perhaps right.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Incidentally, one of the smartest presidents I think we had was Jimmy Carter. And a lot of people poo-poo that because he was not a great president or great politician. But what he did have was intelligence. We ignored the fact that he graduated with high honors from Annapolis in atomic physics, and indeed was the man who designed our first atomic submarines. He was no lightweight in intelligence.
And a very good ex-president.
Oh, yes. Oh, I'll say. Terrific. There hasn't been one like him in our time.
Mr. Cronkite, what was the biggest mistake you made during your career as a journalist?
Oh, boy, did you hear that one?
I heard it. I heard it, but I don't appreciate it. The greatest mistake I made. You know, it's not like I had a lot of them to think of. But I've made a lot of mistakes, but they were, I'm trying to think of any of them really that changed the course of history, and I happily can't really think of one of those. There were ones made in text, that is, I felt we shouldn't have carried a story after we did, and the one of those that I made the worst mistake, there was a rather high-ranking politician whose son was arrested for using marijuana right in the period when a lot of young people were doing it. And I realized almost immediately after broadcasting it that it was the most unfair thing to lay off the responsibility for that on the father when we had no real knowledge of how well he had raised the young man, since there were so many of them out there doing that sort of thing.
Good point.
In your opinion, Mr. Cronkite, which was the most significant event of the 20th century in shaping our country?
Well, I'd go again on our landing on the moon. It put us far ahead in a very important technical race, but it also put mankind in far ahead in the possibility of exploration of the future. So I think it was the most important story of all time. Of course, there were a lot of important stories that we covered day to day. Our wars, going into Korea, for heaven's sakes, and most importantly right now with the war that we're seem to be sunk in for time far longer than it should be, and other technical and political mistakes have been made down the years, of course, and they will probably continue to be made.
What do you think of the current status of the space program?
Well, it's in almost a recess right now. We are just beginning to get to work really and trying to improve the safety of the shuttles so that we can go back and do our work in space. It's rather essential that we do, because we can't take our own ships now up to the International Space Station, and we have to depend on the Soviet ships. That shouldn't be. We should be making our own trips out there. We can, for one thing, we can carry a lot more material in our shuttles than they can in there. So we've got a safety factor. We're endangering the lives of those astronauts and cosmonauts in the space station by taking more trips out there and possibly failing.
Have you ever announced any collegiate radio or television contests?
Have you ever announced a collegiate contest or radio on TV? Do you mean a sporting event? Yes. We're wondering whether you've been a sports reporter in your spare time.
What was the question?
Yes.
What problem have I had?
Have you ever done it? Have you ever announced sporting events?
Oh yes, yeah, I did. I did both sports on radio and also from the scene on television. I covered television, Big Ten, for a couple of years. The problem doing it on radio got kind of sticky at times. We had a very complicated but wonderful system. We could, from a small station, we could order up a big game of the week, as late as a day or two before the game, as long as the network, because it wasn't covering it. And if it didn't, we could order the game from Western Union. And it was done very well. I don't know how those Western Union telegraph operators were so good, but they were great reporters. And they had just a telegraph machine, and they sat in the press box and play by play reported what was going on the field. We in the studios, we sat there and they typed this up on silent typewriters, as nearly silent as you could get, and they would sit right in front of us, and we'd sit there at the microphone and reading a code message, and the code message would just be very simply done. They would tell a play, for instance. They'd say Jones 3 right half, and then maybe Harrison. With just that little bit of information, 4 words, what you would do, saying, and there's the snap, and Jones has got the ball. He's going over toward the left line. He's going over. He's gone in through the left line, but they got him down there. He couldn't have made more than 3, maybe 4 yards. We'll know in a minute. But boy, I tell you that tackle was one of the best I've ever seen. That was Henry that got the tackle again, and he playing some game of football today, that boy. Then they recite again where the ball game was. There were sometimes a little bit of problem. There was a day when frequently the wire would go down for just a minute or 2 minutes, and you go into a little panic, and they'd get right back. But there was a day I was doing the Southern Cal Notre Dame game, which was a very big game, particularly in Kansas City, where our station was, which had a large Catholic audience, and a lot of the guys went over to Notre Dame, and anyway, we did the game. We did it very well. I thought I did it very well, at any rate. But there was a day when on that game, that most important game, it was being played out in California, and the wire went down completely. It was about in the third quarter. It went down completely. Well, I thought it'd be back in a minute or so, or 2 minutes. So I was ad-libbing, and I ad-libbed a play, and had no gain, of course, on it. And then it was, this wire was still out. So I had a timeout. I had a little timeout there, and the timeout ran out of time. So I had another little play, which didn't get very far. And that period of silence lasted 45 minutes. I had the longest quarter ever played in college football. And when the game came back on my air, the Southern Cal had scored, whereas I had Notre Dame with the ball most of the time. But I had to get them the game in Southern Cal's hands and get up the field and make a score. It wasn't exactly on the newspapers the next day what I had told people happened, but nobody ever really caught on, apparently. Incidentally, I wasn't the only guy that had kind of problem. Ronald Reagan did the same thing on radio on baseball. And he actually was at a station fairly near mine. He was in Des Moines doing this baseball thing, which was a simple thing to do with baseball, you know, nothing to do. I had to have these guys getting extra, but he had a simple thing. But one day, he and I were talking, and we were talking about our days, and I told him about my 45-minute quarter. Well, he laughed, thought this was pretty funny. We had quite a talk over it. Maybe it was 2 or 3 months later. A fellow who knew Reagan well said, hey, you did television, you did radio thing. Did you ever hear the story that Ronnie had when his source went down and he had to make up a baseball game? And I said, did he do that? He said, yes, he tells the stories. It's a whale of a story to tell. It's wonderful. We all know from his political stories that he didn't tell the truth all the time. And he didn't. When he got a good story in hand, he used it. So he got my story. And I never knew whether he really did that baseball game or not.
One last question.
Mr. Cronkite, you've recently been more outspoken on the political front. Were there times as a newscaster when you had to bite your tongue when you really wanted to say something?
I bit my tongue right out of my cheek many times. A lot of times. There was not our job as the news broadcaster to do any editorial comments. We had editorialists on our staff. We had Eric Severide, a very great reporter, a very intelligent man. He was our commentator. I was the straight newsman. I occasionally slipped and got a couple of editorial words in, but I didn't dwell on it very long. I would have been fired, I think. I was not the commentator. Since I have been in television, I have a news column in the newspapers. 180 papers take my column once a week, and that is pure column material. That is editorial. I'm free to say whatever I want to say, and I tell people that I am a non-party liberal. I'm a liberal, but I do not belong to a political party. I never have and never will.
Let us all thank Walter Cronkite for spending an evening with us.
Thank you. It was great. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much.
I've got to explain one thing.
Okay.
Since this is a sporting group, I do not have rheumatism as an old man. I instead pulled my Achilles tendon playing tennis. That was 4 years ago when I was just turned 95. And I want to tell you, I won. It was a singles game, and I won it.
Thank you, sir.
But the leg's still bad. Great. Just wonderful.
Thank you.